Hello, and welcome to lesson 9, my apologies. Welcome to lesson 9, Spanish Literature and the Conquest of the New World. As I mentioned last time, Spain became an imperial power during the Renaissance period, so we're spending this lesson on the literature that was produced during that time. We're looking at two texts, well, one text and then a set of texts, actually, that seem very different initially. First, we're looking at Don Quixote, which is the first novel written in the Western world, and the only novel we're looking at in this course, because novels really become popular after the time period of this course. Novels really become popular around the middle of the 19th century. And then in the second half of the lesson, we're looking at some texts that were written about the conquest of the New World. So they seem very different because Don Quixote is dealing with all of these things that are happening within Spain. Whereas the set of texts from the second half of the lesson deal with all of these things that are happening out in Spain's colonies. But there's actually a great deal of thematic overlap between the two that we'll talk about. I don't think I've mentioned in too much detail yet how chivalry fell out of popularity during the Renaissance. And this is very important to understanding Don Quixote. With a lot of the new technological developments, war was something that was no longer seen in such a glamorous way as it was during the Middle Ages when they had jousting and these duels and whatnot. So that certainly helped depopularize chivalry. But also, as I mentioned last time, think of the three I's of the Renaissance: individuality, interiority, and identity. People began to think about what it meant to be an individual and how they identified themselves. Chivalry was all about pledging oneself to a king, to a nation. And so that would go against the individualistic thinking of the Renaissance. And so chivalry was no longer as popular as it once was. And that, in a sense, enabled Don Quixote to go in and make this commentary on society. For Cervantes to make this commentary on society through Don Quixote's character. So, because Cervantes is making a commentary on society, it's important for us to look at society at the time. Don Quixote is considered the first novel in Western literature. The Tale of Genji, which was published in 11th century Japan, is really like the first novel ever written. But critics think of that as part of Eastern lit, and this is more of a Western lit class. So many think of Don Quixote as the first novel in Western literature. And like I said, he's writing this in the late 16th, early 17th century. Novels really don't become popular for 250 years after this. There are other novels written before the mid-19th century, but the mid-19th century, when the working classes become educated in Europe and America, is really when the novel takes off in popularity. Cervantes wrote some from his own experience, both in military combat and as a prisoner of war. He received 3 gunshots during his military service. One permanently wounded his left hand, which is really fascinating since he wrote quite a bit. Don Quixote is a really long novel, and so he was able to do that despite the wound to his left hand. And it wasn't uncommon for people from the upper class to be held captive by pirates for a ransom, and so Don Quixote was held captive for 5 years before he was finally released, directly after his military combat. And so he didn't make it home until 1580. And so that experience showed him some of the harshness of the world, the harshness of military combat, and that certainly informs the text here. His military experience is significant in part because Spain became a universal power. By universal power, I mean it was big enough that its empire covered significant parts of the world. They colonized the most in the Americas, mainly Central and South America, but also other parts of the world, making them not the largest empire in the history of the world. That'd be the British Empire, but certainly up there. And at this time, England was still a new country at this time, so Spain was the biggest power in the world during this time, during the 16th, 17th century late Renaissance period. As we've talked about before, maintaining an empire that big is very difficult because the empire has to expend so many resources, and this led to all kinds of problems. Corruption, bankruptcy of the crown, in order to try to pay for their empire, to pay for all this all these military campaigns. They had to impose incredibly high taxes on their citizens, which led to a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and really, unfair circumstances for their citizens at home. So this is where we see the connection between Don Quixote and the text we'll talk about in the second half of the lesson. Cervantes paints this very vivid, real, almost shocking portrait of the poverty and corruption in Spain. And that poverty and corruption is caused in a major way by the empire. So the first half of the class today, we're looking at the most famous text from Spanish literature and how it depicts the fallout of managing an empire. And in the second half of class, we're looking at the actual texts that deal with that empire. Some of the tensions that appeared in Spain because of the empire were racial tensions, and Cervantes would have understood this to a certain extent. It hasn't been fully proven, but many scholars believe that Cervantes likely possessed Jewish ancestry, which would have made him a bit of an outsider and caused him to face many limitations. And they cite, some scholars who believe he had Jewish ancestry cite some of these limitations as proof of that. One example being that he never received any medals for his military combat, and he had some significant achievements there that would have likely necessitated a medal for someone who was not, considered an outsider because of their race. Another example of racial tension in Spain at this time is between Muslims and Spaniards. The conquest of Spain and the empire had led to many Muslims being forcibly or willingly converted to becoming Christian. Many of them lived in Spain. Many of their descendants lived in Spain, and even though they had been converted, they still were not treated as equals. So they were often denied rights. Many were eventually kicked out of the country. And the descendants of Muslim converts were living in Spain were called Moriscos. And a Morisco actually appears in a very significant way in Don Quixote. The text has multiple narrators. It's not just one omniscient, all-knowing narrator we follow the whole time. Right at the end of this section I asked you to read for class today, the narrative actually stops as Don Quixote is dueling the Basquian, and the narrator comments on how he didn't have the rest of the manuscript and he had to find it, and he went to this market and found a man who had translated the rest of it, and so he then used that manuscript. And that man that the narrator says he meets is a Morisco, and he's using that manuscript. So following the events where we left off in the reading I assigned to you, you actually have a Morisco narrating a good chunk of Don Quixote, which is really interesting because Moriscos were marginalized figures at this time. So Cervantes is incorporating into Don Quixote the perspective of an individual who would be considered a racial outsider. This also shows somewhat how the text is a parody. There's not one sole all-knowing author. There are these, multiple narrators here. I mean, Cervantes is the only author, but he doesn't present one narrator who's all-knowing. He presents multiple narrators, and so that already makes it seem like kind of a farce and shows that he's drawing us into this world of parody and satire. Um, when I asked you in your reading questions what the experience of reading the novel was like, this may seem like a less critical type of question than I typically ask, but I think it's very important. This is our first and only time reading a novel in the course, and it's a very different novel. It is a novel, but it's probably not like most of the novels you read today because it's a satire. Um, so it's very funny. It's making jokes the whole time, but it's also deeply sad. Um, we see Don Quixote nearly die, get beat half to death repeatedly. We see other people getting beat up or other very painful encounters. And so that juxtaposition of the humor that makes us laugh and the sadness that makes us pity people shows that this is a very specific genre of writing called satire. If you don't know what satire is when the author uses humor to make an important point. So some examples from today's world would be things like The Daily Show or The Colbert Report or Saturday Night Live. Um, Sometimes those things are using satire just to be funny or just to point out how absurd something is, and then it's really more of a parody than a satire. But sometimes they go beyond that. Sometimes they have a very important or significant political point they're trying to make. When they use humor to do that, it's satire. And so Cervantes is using humor to show us some things about Spain at the time. That his readers experienced on a daily basis, but weren't things that were talked about much in literature. So by using humor to bring those things to light, he makes a very poignant message. If he had just written an essay on why chivalry is outdated and how hard it is to live in Spain, it probably wouldn't be remembered as a classic. But he creates these iconic scenes, such as Don Quixote battling the windmills, that are still remembered today. When someone is doing something crazy or idealistic, and we don't think they'll succeed, we say they're tilting at windmills. And that's because of the scene in Don Quixote. So the humor makes it funny and memorable. And then the sad, tragic parts bring us back to reality, and the political point Cervantes is making comes through. We'll talk more about what that point is as we go on in the lesson. There's also some difficulty reading the text, is another reason why I asked this question. It can be confusing. What is real and what is not real? We get immersed into Don Quixote's world in a way that makes it very believable, even though he's fantasizing a lot of these things. For instance, it's easy to read this text and believe that the lady Dulcinea is an actual character, a person, but she's really just a figment of his imagination. She may be very loosely based on a real person, but she has no idea who Don Quixote is or what he's doing. So it can be hard to pick up on the fact that, say, a character like her, this woman he's pledged himself to, he's constantly evoking her name, it can be hard to tell that she's not, a real character and just a figment of his imagination as we read. So this gap between fantasy and reality that's even difficult for the reader to follow helps us appreciate Don Quixote's madness and his insanity, helps us experience the world as Don Quixote does, which is crucial to Cervantes' point. And with the other question here about chivalry, Cervantes is mocking chivalry in part for the reasons we talked about on that first slide, that it's become kind of outdated due to the technological advances and emphasis on individuality that were major parts of the Renaissance. But many people were still reading books of chivalry, perhaps believing what was contained in them. And so Cervantes is really trying to say here that we can't live in a fantasy world. We have to face the harsh truths of our world and perhaps do something about it. So he's mocking kind of the idealistic nature of chivalry and trying to reveal, these greater truths, hard truths about the world. Looking more closely at the text, we can start to understand how Don Quixote sees the world. The first author continually refers to him as a madman. And authors in quotation marks there. It's really the first narrator. Um, but this narrator uses the first person and intrudes on the text, even though they're not a direct character in the text. So the narration here is very important. As I mentioned a few slides ago, the narration shifts at several times throughout the text to another individual. And as the text goes on, Don Quixote becomes less and less obviously mad. He becomes famous beyond what we read for class today. He becomes famous for his exploits, and so later narrators are more sympathetic to him than this first narrator who calls him a madman. So as we read on, we get to a point where much later in the novel, he's potentially realizing what's going on. He kind of makes jokes. Don Quixote makes jokes and hints at, alludes to the fact that he may know these things aren't real, but that he's going along with this farce. And then toward the very end of the text, he kind of gives up on the fantasy, and people like Sancho Panza and others want him to go back into it before he eventually dies of old age. So early with the first narrator, Don Quixote is presented as very mad and completely believing these different fantasies, and then later, as we go in the text, he seems more and more sane and believing them less, and other people wanting him to believe those things. And so initially, Cervantes uses Don Quixote's madness to show us how absurd the world is. The world Cervantes lived in is one in which there was such a gap between the rich and the poor, and there were so many unfair taxes for the working class and the lower class because of the imperial expansion and military conquest, that you could have a situation like the one you see in the novel when you have the farmer whipping the young boy and totally abusing his power and taking it out on this kid. And so Cervantes is using Don Quixote's madness to say, look how absurd the world is. Look at what can happen when we live like this, when we live in poverty, and we don't do something to help the people of our country. He's saying it's absurd to live like that by showing us this mad character. Then as the text goes on, in Don Quixote's, it's less obvious that Don Quixote is insane, and he becomes popular. His absurdity becomes kind of a message of hope. Cervantes is still mocking chivalry, but Don Quixote is believing, that he can make a change or make a difference or do all of this. And so that becomes kind of a hopeful thing for these people like Sancho Panza, who are completely downtrodden by their life and poverty and squalor. And so, Don Quixote's message is still one that's completely, absurd or insane, but it's actually giving hope to people. And so Cervantes, through these multiple narrators, uses Don Quixote's madness in several ways, but it all comes back to that idea that the empire is causing corruption and poverty at home. We see this time and time again. For instance, when Don Quixote interacts with the maidens and the innkeeper. It's just really interesting to see the reaction of these maidens as Don Quixote comes up to them, and they're, just very average women. I think that the text even alludes to the idea that they might be prostitutes at one point. They're used to living a hard life, and he basically calls them these beautiful, lovely ladies and elevates their status. And of course they don't believe him. They think he's kind of crazy, and it's almost sad how they treat him at first. But at the same time, there's this reaction, kind of surprising reaction on their part. Well, this guy really thinks something of us, even though no one else does. And he continues, out of his misguided chivalry quest to stand up for the little guy, for people who no one is standing up for, like the kid being beat by the farmer. And so even though what Don Quixote does just makes things worse for the kid being beat by the farmer, it's still, at least initially perhaps might give that kid some hope or something. And so this text really reveals how difficult people in the working class had it at this time, how difficult their lives were. And again, Don Quixote kind of gives them hope through his madness, even though they're laughing at him, even though we're laughing at him. The text is very violent. I just mentioned the scene where the farmer is whipping the young boy who works for him, and how Don Quixote's intervention unfortunately actually makes the farmer whip him more. This is a very violent scene. And you also see Don Quixote getting beat half to death right after that. This text is filled with some pretty shocking violence. Now, we've seen people's brains being splattered about in Song of Roland, so that's not something that's new in this class. But it's portrayed in a different way here by Cervantes. In Song of Roland, the violence is glorified. It's duels between knights, or knights dying in battle to serve their king, or even when Ganelon is executed in that text, it's supposed to be this great example of medieval justice, of God's justice. And so here you see violence in a much grittier and real way, in a way that shows how horribly violence can be used for such awful things by someone beating someone else who is helpless after underpaying them. And so we can get very consumed in Don Quixote's fantasy world. And as we get consumed in his fantasy world, we can get really caught up, but Cervantes always brings us back to reality before we get too far. Someone gets beat up, someone gets maimed, and we realize, oh my gosh, 16th century Spain is this corrupt place where, the helpless can be picked upon and exploited. But we also see the ability of Don Quixote's fantasy to influence other characters. We talked about how it might even give some hope. He eventually convinces an innkeeper to knight him. Right at the end of the part we read for today, for this lesson, we see him dueling the Boscian, which just means a man from the province of Basque. And this guy gets really into it. At first, he's not very motivated. And then if you look at that passage, I have the passage listed on the next slide, the Boscian's just kind of sort of in this, and then he sees Don Quixote's enthusiasm for this duel, and he himself, the Boscian, gets really into it too. And if you were to read the rest of the novel, you see that later on, when Don Quixote gives up his quest, other people want him to resume it. And there's also a character late in the novel who becomes a knight himself, also pretends to be a knight to challenge Don Quixote. And so we see his fantasy world rubbing off on people. And so it shows how influential these ideas are, that Don Quixote's almost, giving people hope, even though he's crazy. And so Cervantes really uses Don Quixote's insanity in several ways here. These are quotes that correspond to the questions I just asked. So you might want to go into the lesson without audio on Canvas and revisit those. Especially the last one there shows how this Boscian really gets riled up when he sees Don Quixote's own energy and enthusiasm for the duel. Here are the questions that you can answer on Canvas if you choose to write on Don Quixote. Do you like Don Quixote or not? I think he can be a very sympathetic character. We get drawn into his story. We feel sad for him, and that helps Cervantes accomplish his goal. But I've also had students, when I've taught this, have really strong reactions against Don Quixote. So I'm curious to hear or read what you think. How does Sancho Panza function as a foil to Don Quixote? it's really important to discuss Sancho, and we haven't much yet. So please, if you want to, discuss him in your posts. He presents this really interesting perspective where he's another character who kind of starts to believe what Don Quixote is saying, but you believe, or I think it's more just wishful thinking than really believing it. He would love to live on an island, but does he really believe Don Quixote will achieve that, or does he just want it so badly that he's going along with him? And I think it's the latter statement I made there, because Sancho's character really represents the desperation of the working poor at this time. But there are lots of ways to interpret his character. So I'm curious to read what you think on that as well. Is the text just a parody? So to clarify, a parody is something that makes fun of something else. And this is clearly a parody of chivalry. But satire goes beyond parody, and satire makes a very specific political point. So is Cervantes challenging the empire here? Is he challenging the corruption and the treatment of the poor? Or is he just mocking chivalry? That's an important question. Finally, the relationship between fantasy and reality. This is very much a text that's relatable because it fulfills some of the childhood fantasies that we've all had. And I think that's why this is a classic that stands the test of time. We've probably all fantasized about becoming Spider-Man or Harry Potter, or fill in the blank for yourself, but someone at some point. And here, Cervantes imagines, what would it be like if someone tried to live out their fantasy instead of saying, I wish I were a knight who fought great battles and rescued a princess, actually went out and tried to be a knight after knights didn't really exist anymore, and he's not even thinking of real knights, he's thinking of ones in fantasy books. So this is an impulse we can almost all relate to. But at the same time, Cervantes really shows the harsh reality of it. If you go and try to actually be a knight, instead of just pretending to be one, you could get killed, which is, repeatedly Don Quixote's life is in danger throughout this text. And so I don't think he's saying that we'll do everything we read in books. I think he's showing what could happen if we try to live that out, and I think he's making a very important point here. A lot of the texts that were published during the Middle Ages and the early part of the Renaissance were used as propaganda, like Song of Roland, to get people to participate in the Crusades. So maybe he's saying don't believe everything you read. There's a lot more to this question. I wasn't trying to answer it for you. I was just trying to give you a starting point so that you can unpack it on canvas. But I think ultimately what Cervantes is doing here is using Don Quixote's fantasy world and bringing that into the conflict with the harsh reality of 16th century Spain to make, a clear point about how hard life was then and the fact that it should be improved. All right, so now that we've studied what's considered the greatest novel in Spanish literature and was written at the time when the Spanish Empire reached its height, and shows kind of the consequences of Spanish imperialism on its citizens at home, we're now going to shift our focus to a text that shows what people thought about the actual experience of imperialism, people who experienced it firsthand. So we've talked about imperialism throughout the quarter. We've understood the definition of imperialism as one country going in, taking over the other country, subsuming it as part of its empire, and oftentimes rooting out the culture that was already there and replacing it with its own culture. We've seen examples of this throughout the course. The Aeneid, clearly, with Rome conquering Carthage, and that text also depicts the fall of Troy. We've seen it in the Song of Roland, where that text is used as political propaganda to recruit people for the Crusades. And you can think of other examples if you took the time to do so. But there's this relationship between imperialism and literature, right? Many people probably actually read Song of Roland and then joined the Crusades and believe the things that text says about Muslims, even though they're mainly cliche stereotypes. And so literature is actually one of the tools of the colonizer. Literature can spread ideas that become cliches, become stereotypes. Um, and it can be highly influential, which is another theme of Don Quixote. So the two sets of texts really tie together nicely in this sense. Here's some background of the conquest of what Europeans called the New World. It started with Columbus's discovery of, to Europeans, what was a new continent. Once Columbus discovered the Americas, and by discovered, clearly he wasn't the first person there, but he was the first European. Well, one of the first Europeans there. The first European there whose journey there led to a lot of subsequent travel and colonization would be the best way to put it. So because most Europeans living during the time of the Renaissance had never been to the Americas before, and the Americas featured such different cultures with the native cultures there that Europe started to think of itself as the old world and called the Americas the New World. Even though the Americas and their indigenous inhabitants had lived there for a very long time, from a European perspective, Europe became the old world and the Americas were the New World. And this caused this kind of huge break, mental break for Europeans. All of a sudden, their old ways of life started to seem very outdated. This is part of why there's so much questioning and inquiry during the Renaissance. Discovery of the quote-unquote New World really shook things up for Europeans. Europeans then began to simultaneously idealize and exploit the innocence of native peoples. So they saw the natives as very innocent, as not fully realizing what the Europeans might do, and idealized that, said, look at how great these people are, they're simpler, and then took advantage of that. They did frequently meet resistance, though, when trying to form alliances and convert natives. The natives would fight back, and you clearly see that in Cortez's letter. Some reformers fought for the rights of natives, like Bartolomé de las Casas, who we'll look at when we turn to the literature, but they were few and far between, and despite the protests, the natives were still often used as forced labor. Many of the texts written during this time, such as the Popol Vuh, which we're studying, as well as the Florentine Codex, which is in our textbook, but I didn't assign, they were not published until well after the Spanish Empire had fallen, to discourage native beliefs. If you look at the mythology and the literature of the native inhabitants of the Americas, and we see one example of that with the Popol Vuh today, it becomes really clear that the New World was only new to Europeans, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago. The native inhabitants of the Americas had a rich cultural tradition that had been around for a long time. It was just new to Europeans, and Europeans were often the victors, and history is written by the victors, so that's why we have the term New World. And the conquest also produced indigenous responses. So the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who we'll look at the end of the lesson, he writes his histories of the Inca people as a response to the texts being written by colonizers like Columbus and Cortez. So it becomes kind of this dialogue where we have different sets of texts today. With the Popol Vuh, we have the only real example of a literary text or literature that tells a narrative, and it tells the stories from Mayan mythology. So the Popol Vuh is kind of off on its own as an example of the rich mythological and literary tradition that existed in the quote New World. Then in a kind of a second category, we have the letters of Cortez and Columbus that show the perspective of the colonizer. And then a third category, we have Bartolomé de las Casas, who rather than supporting imperialism, critiques it, even though he's also Spanish. And then finally, we have the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who outright challenges imperialism and is the only text where we see a purely native response, a native voice coming through. With the reading questions, I'd like to first look at Popol Vuh. It's an example of Mayan mythology. Now, this is one of those texts that it tells stories. The twins defeat seven Macaw, the twins' victory in the underworld. These are stories from Mayan mythology, but they were part of an oral tradition before the Popol Vuh was written. And the Popol Vuh was written by native inhabitants of the Americas, but with the help of European, I think mainly Spanish missionaries. So we don't have any source material that's completely, has no European influence at all. So we kind of have to ask as we read this, how much of it is really coming from the native inhabitants and how much is European influence. But with that said, it does have some really interesting instances that, these examples that seem would go against European values. For instance, trickery is used quite a bit. And you may be familiar with Native American trickster tales. So the trickster figure is very popular in Native literature all throughout the Americas. But here we have the twins. And they defeat seven Macaw by basically having their grandparents, who are also gods, tricking him into letting them remove his teeth. And they replace his teeth with corn, and his teeth were originally all these jewels. And he's this villainous figure because he's very prideful of the jewels in his teeth. And so once his teeth are replaced with corn, he's defeated. And so it's a story that probably seems odd to the Western reader. Dentists essentially defeat this prideful character. But what seems to stand out there is the use of trickery, right? The twins become kind of these trickster figures there. And then in the underworld, they have victory in the underworld in the next story by showing the gods of the underworld their ability to kill themselves and then resurrect themselves after they die. So they kill themselves, resurrect themselves over and over again. They convince the gods of the underworld that they'll be able to do this too. But then after the gods of the underworld die, they kill themselves. They don't bring them back. And so, again, it's another trick to defeat this enemy. And so you see trickery being used quite a bit here. And so this is a way in which, Europeans would see this as part of being the new world, because coming out of the Middle Ages, trickery and deception were seen as these really negative things in the Middle Ages, when loyalty and honor were valued above all else. But if you look farther back in time, say to the Odyssey, you see Odysseus using cunning and strategy and trickery to make it home, and that was valued then. So it's not completely unheard of at all. It's just not something Europeans would have been super familiar with at this time. So it seems new to them, but it's really old. And it's really mainly just different from European culture rather than being new or old or good or bad or something. What happens is someone, in this case Europeans, go out, they colonize another country, they encounter a culture that's very different, and they immediately label that culture as different and assign positive or negative connotations to it. And that leads to stereotypes that persist. So the Popol Vuh has some European influence on it, but at the same time, also really illustrates clearly how the native cultures in the Americas were very different and just as old as the European cultures, if not older. So that's the first text. The text from Mayan mythology, that's one example of the rich literary and mythological tradition that existed in the Americas before Europeans arrived. In the next category, we have Columbus and Cortez, who present the natives as inferior in their letters back to the crown in order to justify their imperial adventures. So one of the reading questions here is, how do Columbus and Cortez present the natives as inferior? We're going to look at that in the next slide. And then there are two different types of texts, but in the last category we have Bartolomé de las Casas and Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who both are more, de las Casas is not a native. He's a European, a Spaniard who was sympathetic to the natives and challenged imperialism, whereas de la Vega was a native. But they could be put in the category of being anti-imperialist, while Columbus and Cortez were obviously pro-imperialist. So it's important to look at the differences in how these two sets of writers describe the natives. So we'll do a little comparing and contrasting on our final slides. So how does Columbus present the natives as inferior? He mentions their nakedness, which shows them as, say, like less civilized than the Europeans. He also mentions himself as like a god, that they saw him as a god coming down. So, he had to justify his voyage. He's actually, I think, Italian, I believe, but he couldn't get support for his voyage in his own country. So he had to go to the King and Queen of Spain to get funding for his voyage. And so he's trying to justify his voyage here and then eventually justify imperialism. And in order to do that, he has to present the natives as inferior. Unfortunately, this becomes a stereotype, thinking of native inhabitants of a non-Western place. And now, by non-Western here, I mean not Western in, beliefs, values, traditions. Geographically, the Americas are located west of Europe, but as I mentioned a few lectures ago, we think of the Western world not as a geographical place, but as a mythological construct. And so the beliefs, values associated with Western, in quote, civilization are very different from the natives of the Americas. And so non-Western people, especially indigenous people of a place that becomes colonized, are often presented as simple, backwards, inferior, and these stereotypes come out of texts like the ones written by Columbus and Cortez. And they use these stereotypes to justify imperialism, that they have to bring enlightenment, that they have to bring Christianity to these people to justify imperialism, and then the ideas become popular and they last, even though they're not necessarily very accurate. And so the nakedness of the natives seeing him as a god as he arrives, is the way Columbus does that. Cortez uses a lot of similar strategies, but one really significant thing he does is he destroys the idols of the native inhabitants, which are their religious figures. Why does he call them idols? Because making an idol a physical representation of a god other than the Christian God is considered a great sin in Christianity. So he calls all the religious figurines built in this vast, impressive Aztec city as idols, and he destroys them. And he puts up pictures of the Virgin Mary and other Christian Catholic emblems. And in doing this, what he's trying to do is root out the native culture and replace it with his own culture. And again, he justifies this. Another negative stereotype you would hear associated with non-Western peoples is the word heathen. And so he uses that to justify imperialism. I mean, Cortez was told by the king and queen to turn back from his voyage. And rather than turn back, he actually burned his ships once they arrived at the shores so that his men couldn't turn on them and follow the king and queen's orders and head back. And so he really has to justify his mission. And he does that by saying these natives aren't Christian, they're heathen savages, and they need Christianity, and we should be here bringing them Christianity. So bad stereotypes that come from Cortez and Columbus's letters are heathen, savage, primitive, backwards, simple, and they use these things to justify imperialism. And unfortunately, the ideas have lasted, which is why it's good that we read texts like this and we see how these ideas came about so we can question and challenge them. And speaking of questioning and challenging them, we can now turn to our other two texts. So Bartolomé de las Casas is a Spanish priest and colonist who lived in the colonies, and he took the opposite view. He uses a number of strategies to argue against imperialism. But like Cortez, he also uses Christianity, just in the other way. Once we go to the next slide, you'll see some quotes, as you always do. And again, you can go to the slide without audio to find those quotes and look them up. But what's interesting is in the quote I have listed there from De las Casas, he actually argues that, he's using the same perspective, that the people need Christianity. So that's still kind of condescending, but he's not doing it in a way that's so obviously negative. He's saying they're wonderful people who are very open and receptive to Christianity, and if we just talk to them, they'll convert. And he contrasts that with the genocidal, grotesque violence that many Spaniards rained down upon the natives, including Cortez. And we see the violence in Cortez's own letter. And so De las Casas says, we don't need to do violence in the name of Christianity here. We can just talk to these people. Unfortunately, his view was much rarer at the time than the view put forth by Cortez and Columbus. Finally, we have the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega. You probably recognize Garcilaso de la Vega from the last lecture. This is a different individual. He was a native of Peru, where the Incas used to live, and he was able to actually get somewhat of a European education. And when he did, and he saw he had a similar name to Garcilaso de la Vega, he kind of adopted that. And that's why he puts Inca in front of it to identify himself. But what he did is he wrote some histories of the Inca people. He thought the Spaniards, say for instance Columbus and Cortez, did not present his people in an accurate or positive way, and he wanted to write his own history of the people. So he uses history and language to respond. He basically, to put it in a very general way, he says, others haven't gotten it right, and I want to get it right. He talks about the alphabet, how Spaniards added letters to his alphabet, and how that's problematic. So he's really using language and history to challenge the way in which Spaniards have portrayed the natives. And he's trying to reclaim the native identity and say, no, this is what it's really like here. Let me show you more about our people. There's much more to us than what you've seen, which is really the best way to fight this literary imperialism. I would call what Cortez and Columbus do literary imperialism, spreading ideas that support imperialism through literature. And the best way to fight that is to offer a different, more nuanced perspective. And that's what the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega does by offering his own history of his people, rather than just accepting the one the Spaniards have written. So these are the passages I was talking about that correspond to what we just went over. And here are the questions for Canvas. I already mentioned how the Popol Vuh was not published during the time in which it was written. So what ideas from it do you think Europeans would want repressed? Furthermore, it was written with the aid of European missionaries. So to what extent does it represent a European perspective? To what extent does it represent a non-European perspective? And to what extent can we have any truly authentic understanding of Mayan mythology? It was an oral tradition, and it wasn't put to paper before European missionaries arrived and helped it be put to paper. So there's no written version that's not tainted, by European influence. But at the same time, I still think it's legitimate to ask what seems European about this text, what seems non-European about it. So this question is kind of related to the first one. On the background and context slide, I'm relating number 3 right now to the background and context slide. I talked about how the Europeans both idealized and also treated as inferior the native cultures. They idealized the simplicity and then took advantage of it. So how can these two views be reconciled? How can someone both revere and demean a culture at the same time? It's paradoxical, but it plays an important role in European imperialism. What is that role? How does someone say, oh, I love these simple people, and then kind of taking all of their stuff? How is that, an important part of imperialism? And finally, we talked about some strategies already that Bartolomé de las Casas and the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega used to challenge Columbus and Cortez. Christianity, history, language, but there's more you could say about those ones, and there are also other strategies too. So on your own, figure out some strategies and discuss those if you decide to answer number 4. And the last comment I'll leave you with is the idea of, well, we may never be able to go back and get, a written account of Mayan mythology before European influence. There's always going to be some degree of influence, either through translation or something else. So maybe we shouldn't be looking for what's more authentic or more real to challenge imperialism, but looking for more variety, more nuance. Well, the term simple has a negative connotation to it. The native inhabitants were less technologically advanced, especially with regard to military achievements, than the Europeans. So we could see how a term like simple would come about. And I'm not condoning it, I'm just saying we can see how it would come about. So it's not that every single thing Columbus and Cortez says is wrong or even inaccurate. It's that it's used to justify imperialism and it doesn't tell the whole story. But Garcilaso de la Vega tells more of the story. So what I'm saying is, to combat the imperialist literature of Columbus and Cortez, we shouldn't necessarily be looking for the real story, because we probably can't find it, but what we should be looking for is more of the story. They're only telling part of the story. We should be looking for more of it. So that's my final thought on these texts.